Welcome everybody to this event, Tackling the Rise of Illiberalism. My name is Elina Troshchenko and I work with the Global Research Program on Inequality GRIP, which is a multidisciplinary research program dedicated to globally collaborative forms of research on various dimensions of inequality. And we at GRIP are very happy to host this important roundtable discussion at the SDG conference Bergen, Day 0. Before I introduce you to today's event and panelists, I need to provide you with some practical information. So firstly, this event is being recorded and it will be made available both on the SDG conference platform as well as on GRIP's website. So please be aware of that. Secondly, we truly hope to make this into interactive events, and therefore we will have a Q&A session later at this webinar. And we will organize it through the Q&A function on Zoom. So please prepare your questions and send it in through there. And thirdly, we also kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted during the event. And now let me briefly introduce the topic of our discussion and our panelists. So for the past 2 decades, the global political landscape has been dominated by the rise of illiberalism. Illiberalism often arriving in disguise of far right-wing populism, to an increasing degree is also interested in the higher education sector. We have seen how educational systems around the world have been under increasing pressure and restrictions from illiberal policies. In the United States of America, new educational acts in different states have prohibited for teachers to instruct on such subjects as race relations and gender diversity. In India, the ruling party is attempting to change the curriculum to follow their preferred monocultural view of countries present and past. And in Hungary, one of the most prominent higher education institutions, Central European University, was forced out from the country by the legislative authorities and had to move their activities to a neighboring country. The attacks on the educational sector by illiberal forces are different, but often aimed at limiting their autonomy and controlling the content of educational materials and research, that is, limiting the academic freedoms. And we can see these developments taking place in different places around the globe. As there has been a growing concern about how illiberal regimes and illiberal ideas are curtailing academic freedoms, we have decided to put together this webinar and a round of discussions to dive deeper in exploring the challenges that illiberal forces pose to the academia and look at the possible ways of tackling these challenges. So to discuss these issues, we have a great lineup of scholars and a student joining us, so allow me to briefly introduce them. Amy Capit is a senior program officer for advocacy at Scholars at Risk Network, where she leads work on the Free to Think report series and the Academic Freedom Monitoring Project, which tracks attacks on higher education communities. She is also the main author behind the latest Free to Think report, in which the spread of illiberalism is named as one of the most significant threats to scholars and academics. Jens Jungblut is associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo. His academic work has been focusing on party politics and public governance in higher education and research policies. He has also recently, with his colleagues, written about the education as a new battleground for the illiberal far right. Shansal Kumshula is a master's student from Turkey studying at the University of Victoria with an academic background in philosophy, sociology, psychology, focusing on gender, sexuality, and immigration. They have been participating in civic engagement in solidarities for LGBTQ+ rights and social recognition both in Turkey and Canada with academic and artistic means. Recently, they have been volunteering at UNICUR under the Access to Equal Rights program. And thank you, Chantal, for joining us in the middle of the night. And finally, but not least, Andrea Pote is a historian professor at the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University. She has published widely on illiberalism and gender studies, and also has actively engaged in public discussions on illiberalism attacks on higher education. So thank you so much all for being here. We're also very happy to kickstart GRIP's engagement with illiberalism theme that we will be working more broadly throughout the year. And I would like to start by getting and also giving our audience a broader sense and a better understanding of what exactly we are dealing with here. So what kind of challenges do illiberal regimes pose to academia and higher education sector, and how we can tackle them? And all of you have been working with this topic and engaging with it in different contexts and from different perspectives. So I would like to give a word to each of you so you can share your reflections, insights, and some key points on this matter with us. Jens, if you would like to start.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Elina, and thanks for the invitation. Let me just try to get my screen shared. Perfect. So I will actually pick up where you ended on, and that is when you introduced me, and that's the paper you mentioned where we looked at the role of populist radical right parties for education policies. But maybe also to frame our work a little bit, since we talk about illiberalism and challenges to the university or education systems, I picked up just a little bit of data from the latest Academic Freedom Index report that the colleagues in Gothenburg have been doing together with the colleagues in Nürnberg-Erlangen. And what this graph shows you, that like the countries that are underneath the line are actually countries that have seen a decrease in the academic freedom, which is statistically significant between 2012 and 2022. And a lot of them are actually autocratic countries where you might expect this, but also there are a couple of democracies. You have Poland, you have India, you've got the US and the UK, you've got Hungary. And so that shows that there's something about politics and the framework within which the education system functions that has an influence on it. Also in the same report, they unpack a little bit more the data and link it to kind of events in politics like Modi becoming the prime minister in India or Donald Trump becoming the president in the US, and what this then does to the measurements of the index. But also, if we look into just like press clippings, we can see there the discussions in the US that also Elina already referred to. But not only there, also in a recent report for the European Parliament that I was involved in, there was kind of one of the conclusions was that, well, issues pertaining to academic freedom are being discussed all around the European Union. So it's not only a problem of countries that are autocratic, that are backsliding or something like this, but it is an issue that is increasingly also a topic in all of our other countries. And for the Norwegian cases, for like discussions around the link to industry, as was the case at NTNU recently, are just highlights of how questions about values and higher education or values in education in general become more prominent in public debates. So this is a bit like the framing of the context that also led us to work on this paper that I'm going to present very briefly now. And it's joint work with Anne Esplanberg and Anna Jupskos here from the Center for Right-Wing Extremism Research at the University of Oslo. And what we were interested in is, what do populist radical right parties want in education policy? Because so far we observed we don't actually know that much what they want to do, and we had the hunch that this might be relevant for how we think about education policy and the political framework in which education policy nowadays is framed. So we looked at party manifestos in 13 countries to map their preferences and find out what kind of policies do they want, and in how far do these policies fit to the ideological roots of these kind of parties. So populist radical right-wing parties are relevant political actors in a lot of West European countries today, also in Central Eastern Europe, but we focus on Western Europe to have a bit more of a coherent kind of case selection. They started often very narrow, focusing, for example, on immigration, but then over time expanded their policies. And political science knows a lot about what they want, but not so much what they want in education. And this is why we were interested in this, especially because if we look at all the descriptions of the modern education systems in Europe, they are often kind of loaded with a lot of liberal values. We want to educate autonomous human beings who think by themselves and so on. And parts of these values are actually quite opposite to what some of these parties actually should normatively desire. So we thought there might be an interesting tension here. So very generally, we looked at education policies along 3 dimensions. So the socioeconomic part, the governance, and very importantly, also the content. And the latter one is the one where I'm going to speak most about, and link this then to the 3 ideological roots of this party family, as Carsten Muller has described it. We looked at 15 parties from 13 countries, mainly Western Europe. But there has been more recent work by other scholars that highlight similar findings also for Central Eastern Europe. So there's, for example, a very recent paper on Slovakia that could be quite interesting. But just to frame what we're talking about, this is mainly Western Europe that we have here. So when we look at what kind of policies do these parties highlight when it comes to education policy and when it comes to questions of redistribution in education, it's interesting that there's kind of a mix of what you would consider like maybe like pro-redistribution left-wing and anti-redistribution right-wing approaches. There's some favoring privatization, some favoring differentiation of students, but others are more in favor of reducing school size, reducing costs for families to attend schools. But in general, there is a focus more on practical instead of academic education. And a focus on differentiation. And this is a part that I will get back to soon. In regard to the government, we actually found that there's a bit of a tension between centralization and decentralization, but there's a strong anti-European and especially also partly an anti-Islamic kind of notion to it, which is maybe not surprising given some of the more nationalist and anti-immigrant positions that these parties hold. Our most interesting findings are maybe on the content dimension, because this is something where if you look at other political parties, they very seldomly take a position on the content of education in their election manifestos. They very often focus on redistribution, governance, but don't say so much about what do we want to teach. And here we found actually that populist radical right-wing parties have quite a big focus on what should education be all about. It's a lot of promoting national language and history in favor of discipline, against what they call a liberal ideology, and in favor of the autonomy of parents to teach moral issues to their children. Also, again, pro-practical skills and sports. And also what they refer to as they want an education system that, quote, trains critical human beings. And that's obviously maybe a somewhat different understanding of critical human beings that some other people would have, but we found that there was really like this focus on really addressing the content of education. So what do we make all of this? Well, we definitely show that these type of parties care about education policy. They do so to a varying extent, but they do care. And we can actually link their ideological roots to these preferences, especially when it comes to the content of education. And we explain this in a way that what these parties do is that they oppose the fundamental values of these West European educational systems. The liberal West European educational ideal is something that they put into question. And here comes back this tension between centralization and decentralization. In a way, the first order preference of these parties, if they can get enough power, is actually to change the values in education. But if they can't get enough power, then the decentralization part comes in, because there's a second order preference of creating these protected islands within an education system that ensures that members of their kind of electorate can opt out of this quote unquote mainstream educational system into pockets where they can follow their own values. And we explain this also by highlighting that obviously challenging values in education molds the minds of future electorates. So you in a way influence your electoral survival in the coming decades through influencing education policy. And I think what's very interesting is also this adoption of labels like critical human beings, because this is for us looked like a way to actually make positions more acceptable for a wider audience, because in most countries you will need other partners to work on these issues. And it also makes the discussion more blurry, as it's not as people would use the same terms but actually loaded with different meanings. And I think this focus on the content of education is really interesting because it creates a political tension on an issue that so far hasn't been politicized very much in education policy. But it also creates an opening for other, maybe more culturally conservative parties to support some of these positions. Like if you think about positions on gender identity, LGBTQI, and these things, it's not only the populist radical right that then kind of follows up on it, but we can also see in some countries that more conservative wings of Christian democratic parties link up with it. So it maybe provides also points where we can see a wider politicization of parts of education policy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jens, for portraying also where this is going in a sense, and what is their interest in the sector. Andrea, would you like to follow up?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be a part of this important discussion. And I put in the chat some of the material, some of the readings you might want to consult with, because I have got only 7 minutes, but I will do my best. So I would like to start, first of all, thanking for all those who supported CEU in the different moments, who signed a petition, and we lost, right? So, and that's actually the starting point, that you might very well ask that why on earth they invited Andrea Pető to talk about this, because she's a loser, right? So, I mean, the CEU was forced from one European Union country to another one. The 2-year gender studies program was deleted from the accredited study list. And also I had to resign from the Hungarian accreditation committee because I could not stand the academic corruption. So my argument will be very much following what Jens was making, namely that adding this extra level that illiberal science policy is hard to recognize as something new, because it is hard to differentiate the illiberal actors' vocabulary from the neoliberal science policy. And this is actually a key point, because you think this is happening somewhere else in faraway countries you know so little, to paraphrase Chamberlain from 1938. But this is actually happening in each and every country, depending on the national context and the different infrastructure. And I'm actually arguing in the works I suggested you to follow that the neoliberal science policy is a precondition for the illiberal science policy. So the illiberalization is not coming from nowhere. It has got several roots. I'm arguing 2 roots. One is the dark legacy of European intellectual history. And the other one is the failures of and the consequences of neoliberalization. And this actually poses lots of challenges. The first challenge is how to deconstruct this hijacked neoliberal language of excellence, competitiveness, impact, social outreach, indices. I mean, this is the language you are expected to use if you want to be a successful academic, and this is a disaster. Also, the concept of internationalization, because this is one of the orthodoxy of higher education. The more international you are, the more competitive you are. And this is no longer true, because internationalization of higher education actually opens up higher education as a for illiberal forces who are hijacking, taking advantage of the different results. So basically the internationalization means also the hijacking of liberal higher education by the liberals, because the liberal higher education doesn't have any protection mechanism. because, okay, I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A. Also, the European quality assurance system is deeply flawed. It doesn't work. So the best example is that when the CEU was forced to exile and the gender studies department was nearly closed, the gender studies program was closed down, the 2-year MA program, then Hungary's accreditation in the European quality assurance system was renewed with flying colors. So that shows that there is something fundamentally wrong here. And this is not only about humanities and social sciences, but also STEM, and that how the liberals are actually hijacking the STEM research together with different very shady corporations who are basically not transparent. And I also consider an important challenge how to move beyond this scholars at risk framework, because this is very problematic on so many different levels. And you have got my this research, the result of the research project in the chat, when we actually argued that the whole mobility scheme of different scholars should be reconsidered, because this is not really helpful. We are also arguing in this paper that the previous explanatory frameworks are not sufficient, because what the first point to think about successful strategies is to understand what's happening now. So that's why I started with this slide explaining that neoliberalization and illiberalization are strongly connected. So the present explanations are saying this is a backlash, that they are longing for these good old times. I actually argue that there was never any good old times for higher education. They think it's authoritarianism. They think it's just a neoliberal managerialism. It's an illiberal takeover, autocratic legalism, constitutional authoritarianism. You know, political scientists are ready to die for a new typology. So this is the result of that. And I actually I mean, Jens already mentioned that, you know, why higher education matters, right? So this is really, luckily we are above this, beyond this discussion that we have to argue why higher education matters. Thanks to the illiberals, right? Because the illiberals made higher education and the higher education research so important, like Steve Bannon, who nearly bought a monastery in Italy to start a university. The Hungarian government was more successful because they bought a private university in Austria, and they start their kind of destructive activity in Austria from this point onwards. So higher education really matters, not only because of the legitimacy, but also the knowledge production. And I skipped this slide because Jens was already arguing very convincingly that this is now a battlefield. What he hasn't mentioned is that it's a good business. It's higher education is a good business, and that's why lots of illiberals are following the money, and they are getting into higher education. Also in relation to the different shady business deals like the PPP. I don't know if you know this, business interest masked as public interest without any public control. And actually, I'm arguing a possible framework to understand what is happening now in the higher education. And together with Weronika Grzebalska, we constructed this concept of the polypore. And this is, before you start Googling what is this polypore, this is this mushroom which lives on the trunk of the tree and uses the resources of the tree to maintain this polypore and produces nothing else than the polypore. This is a kind of mushroom. And these new illiberal states are actually creating parallel higher education institutions. They are using the network, they are using the resources from the already existing public institutions, and then they are creating these parallel institutions, like Steve Bannon wanted to create this monastery in Italy, and the Hungarian government successfully bought this university. And they also started another activity, which is the Matthias Corvinus College in Budapest, also in Brussels, and also in the US, which already shows that there is an alternative internationalization of higher education. And the other concept I'm suggesting to use, besides this polypore state, which redefines higher education, is the liberal pragmatism, that anything goes. And that actually poses a challenge for academics who were trained to look for consistency, causality, and rational arguments. Here, you cannot find that rational argument. Why is this happening now? Because of the poly crisis, and I put into the chat the link to this a podcast series when we are using the sleepwalking metaphor to understand science, education, and knowledge production. So if you are have got long drives, this is the podcast to listen. And here is the characteristics of the illiberal academic policies, which are founding parallel research institutions, hijacking quality assurance, using non-transparent hiring processes, impoverishing the state-funded institutions, remasculinization of science. This is something really important because in these networks only men are there. And also the reaction is the self-censorship and the control of classrooms and funding. And the European Union funding is really not important. And I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A about what was the consequence that Hungary was banned from the Erasmus scheme, because this surprisingly created an interesting alliance between the British higher educational institutions, which are also cash hungry, and they are also outside the Erasmus scheme. So now the British and the Hungarian universities are creating this unholy alliances, no matter that, you know, the colleagues in the US, in the British higher education, they know what they are getting into, but money talks. Money talks. So for gender studies, I'm actually arguing that this is a political opportunity. As for in the big picture, for higher education, because of the intervention of the liberals into higher education, it made it important for our colleagues, comrades, and friends, also for gender studies. It's a political opportunity. We never had so many applications at the CU Gender Studies Department in Vienna than ever, because gender studies became cool. And also the Academic Freedom Index now is connected to gender equality and teaching gender studies, which I don't think it's unproblematic. And that's also another topic we can discuss. And what kind of reactions are there? Like the several new universities are being founded, like the Free University in Budapest. They were bearing the Hungarian higher education, or the university I'm involved, the University of New Europe, basically saying that maybe the neoliberal higher education system doesn't work saving. So let's think about other ways of saving the intellectual space for knowledge production. And here is a list of possible different institutions which are trying to create alternative institutions. Plus, you have your kitchen, which is the most transformative place where you can discuss with colleagues. And so education matters, and no matter that there were like several 100,000 people protesting for CEU in Budapest with this banner that "Why are you afraid of education?" This is a story we lost. And I'm actually arguing that we might want to take a time to think about what were the failures, what were the betrayals, and what can we learn from this story and from this discussion, what we have lost, right? And thanks a lot. And I stop sharing here, and I'm ready for the questions. And I think this discussion is very timely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for the overview and also how you connected the illiberal moves also with the neoliberal policies that we all have been living already for quite a while. And also giving us insight into how new alliances, unexpected alliances, are being also forged in these times. So I just also wanted to remind to our audience that you can send in your questions through Q&A. So please feel free to do that. But now we're going forward with Chantal. And once again, we're very happy to have also a student voice in these discussions, as academia consists not only of scholars, but also of students. So Chantal, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. I'm excited to be part of these meaningful conversations, and I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Elina and other organizers for recognizing the importance of including student perspectives. And I might be what my partner affectionately calls a forever student. My educational journey kicked off in 2013 as an engineering student at Middle East Technical University in Turkey, leading me down unexpected paths, a rabbit hole to eventually complete a double major and minor in social sciences. And here I am doing a master's degree in sociology in Canada. Beyond my studies, I'm actively involved with UniQueer, University Queer Research and LGBTI Solidarity, where I have the privilege of connecting with university students across Turkey. And this engagement allows me to bring, I hope, diverse perspectives and insights into the conversation, especially considering the invaluable research UniQueer conducts with universities. And I'm genuinely honored that they placed their trust in me, bringing these multifaceted perspectives to our discussion today. And I will discuss both my experience as a student who was under the pressure of a highly politicized university, and as a sociology student who is gradually gaining insights to situate their own experiences within the broader structural issues of current rising far-right regime in Turkey. The illiberal regimes in Turkey are affecting the higher education sector through various policy changes and interventions. And I would like to start with a bigger and more striking example to illustrate the state's attitude in that broader frame. On March 20, 2021, the Turkish government withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, a human rights treaty of the Council of Europe against violence against women and domestic violence that had been previously ratified in Turkey in Istanbul in 2012. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as you probably know, Turkey's president, announced the country's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention by presidential decree, which is a procedure many experts in Turkey criticize as unconstitutional. By dismissing an international treaty aimed at protecting vulnerable groups, particularly LGBTQ+ individuals and women, the government exhibits an illiberal approach that undermines the principles of inclusivity and diversity. And this decision, based on unfounded claims, reflects a broader trend of limiting freedom of expression and perpetuating discrimination ideologies. Unfortunately, this pattern is also evident in academia, very predominantly. Such illiberal policies contribute to an environment where critical thinking, diversity, and thought and academic freedom are suppressed. One of the big examples would be the Council of Higher Education's decision in February 2019 to terminate the gender equality project at higher education institutions. This project aimed to promote gender equality in universities. These initiatives were aimed at raising awareness of gender equality in universities and combating harassment and assault on campuses. The termination not only initiated a wave of hatred and violence affecting LGBTQ community within the academic sphere, but also led a reduction in policies and projects striving to incorporate gender equality courses into curricula. Additionally, the appointment of university rectors without considering election results or holding elections within the university, the closure of student clubs, the collaboration between university administrations and law enforcement negatively impact campus dynamic and freedom of expression on campus. Furthermore, research centers, particularly those focused on gender studies, have been affected by state interventions, budget cuts, and name changes, especially adopting titles like Women and Family Research Center instead of gender and women's studies indicates a shift in emphasis. If I circle back to my experiences being a student in a university in Turkey under the rising far-right regime, involved facing tangible challenges related to shrinking freedoms, especially the freedom I experienced on campus drastically changed from 2013 to 2021. The political landscape has led a visible impact on an academic freedom, and I have experienced a sense of self-censorship, and so this also among other students and my professors to avoid any form of scrutiny from the authorities most of the time. It is very disheartening to see that the class I graduated with is now scattering all around the world. I want to mention a couple of pinpoints that also led me to migrate to Canada and become an international student. The first event was witnessing certain academics and graduate students expelled from the Academics for Peace, and I think Andre also give an example as how the solidarity platforms continue to help and organize with those academics. And the second biggest factor that I will never forget was witnessing the change at the university's Pride March. At my university in Turkey, I witnessed increasing police violence against LGBTQ people at marches, and many of my friends were beaten up or arrested in front of my eyes about these bans. That's one thing that is important, that there's a recent court decision against the ban of the Pride Walk, and I think this reflects very well that the ongoing struggle between illiberal forces and democratic principles within the higher education, emphasizing the importance of preserving constitutional rights in the face of growing authoritarianism. And the last point, and the primary factor prompting my decision to pursue my master's in Canada, as opposed to my initial plan pursuing a PhD after finishing my master's in my university in Turkey, is the pervasive sense of insecurity stemming from censorship in classes and constraints on discussing LGBTQ+ topics during lectures and limitations on exploring these subjects in assignments and theses. After sharing my potential thesis topic with my professors, their direct advice, personal advice to me to pursue my studies in a more open and accepting environment, abroad, that played a big, crucial role in my choice. And then forwarding today, when I talk with my friend Ajam from Uniqueer, whose research topic is very similar to mine, very similar, they expressed that they had to censor government-related matters, participants' expressions, potential areas that they could be legally challenged, and all the interests of the safety of participants and themselves as a researcher. And they're doing a research about non-binary people in Turkey, similar to me, that I'm also conducting with experiences. And they said that they had to soften the expressions in the discussions and conclusion sections, resorting to using a vague language after having many meetings with their supervisor, because basically they don't want to get into trouble. So the contrast is very evident and very striking. And all these points and experiences serve as a stark reminder that illiberal regimes in Turkey wield significant influence molding the educational landscape through the suppression of diversity, the imposition of narrow ideological frameworks, and restriction of fundamental rights within academic institutions. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts and experiences, and I will gladly expand my experiences with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal, for sharing your experiences with us and telling us more about what it meant to be a student in Turkey under this rising illiberal forces. Amy?
Thank you. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay. All right. So let me say, first of all, I really appreciated listening to all three presentations that came before me. And I think what I'm going to be talking about has a lot of overlap, and I think you'll recognize certain themes in my presentation that you've already heard today. Today I'm talking somewhat sort of wearing two different hats. So the first hat is as Senior Program Officer for Advocacy at Scholars at Risk. As Alina said at the beginning, I lead the organization's Academic Freedom Monitoring Project. And that project, which was launched 11 years ago, is intended to uncover and draw attention to the global problem of attacks on higher education communities. So for that, we track both attacks on academic freedom as well as attacks on free expression on campus, slash sometimes we call it student free expression. And so at the end of October, we released Free to Think 2023, which is the latest edition of our annual monitoring project, which this year's edition analyzes 409 attacks on scholars, students, and their institutions in 66 countries and territories between July 1st, 2022 and June 1st, 2022 and July 3rd and July, my apologies, July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. And then the second thing that the project that I'm going to be talking about, or hat that I'm wearing, is as an independent researcher for the past few years, I've been working with the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund, SAI, on a project that aims to understand the repression of student activism. So I have on the screen some of the details of that project, but I'll just say, for the sake of time, that over the past 9 months of that project, we've conducted qualitative interviews with about 28 students, student activists globally, and collected survey responses from around 263 student activists. We're currently analyzing and writing up that research, but I have some kind of preliminary ideas from that research that will make their way into the presentation today. I think everybody so far has mentioned the Academic Freedom Index. I'm going to also refer to it. And just to say that I want to underscore the relationship between illiberalism, rising authoritarianism, and democratic backsliding, and their effect on academic freedom, actually interrelationship with academic freedom. So first of all, just to say what I mean when I'm talking about illiberalism, I would define illiberalism as a political system that uses ostensibly liberal or democratic laws, rules, and norms as window dressing for laws, rules, and norms that are actually undemocratic. And as illiberalism has spread, we see both authoritarian and democratic states alike using similar practices to suppress dissent or promote particular ideologies. And I think that that's important because the fact that democratic states are using illiberal practices also provides further justification for authoritarian states to do the same. So I think we see this kind of coalescing of the practices that democratic and authoritarian states are using, bringing the two closer together. And this extends to the higher education arena, where SAR's monitoring work shows that attacks occur both on closed authoritarian societies, where dissent has long been viewed as destabilizing and the right to think and speak routinely suppressed, as well as open democratic societies, whereas others who have spoken today have said liberal actors are increasingly using language like rights, freedom, and excellence to push forward their own agendas and erode academic freedom and the higher educational autonomy. So that theme of language, I think, has really come through today in the presentations. And that's something that I would just underscore. The graph on the screen shows the democratic decline that we've seen over the last few years in the field of academic freedom. So according to VDEM, which measures how democratic societies are across the world and which the Academic Freedom Index is part of, one of the factors that is most negatively impacting the quality of democracy is the declining level of academic freedom. What you see on the screen is some of the countries that Scholars at Risk highlighted in our most recent report, Free to Think 2023, which is the majority of countries that we highlighted where academic freedom has dropped significantly in statistically significant ways over the past 10 years. And also just note that I did some work kind of comparing the Academic Freedom Index to civic engagement a while ago, and the two things are highly correlated. And why does this matter? First of all, there's the immediate impacts. So attacks on higher education, including illiberal attacks on higher education, kill, injure, imprison, and they damage academic careers and deter future civic engagement of individuals. But also more broadly, there's a reciprocal relationship that I was just talking about between academic freedom and democracy. So even the more subtle forms of attack have a corrosive impact on scholars and students' ability to research, teach, learn, and share ideas. And an attack on a single individual often ripples out beyond that individual with a chilling effect on the rest of society, threatening the foundations of democracy and degrading the environment that higher education needs to further social change, social justice, social development. Just going to spend the rest of the time that I have focusing on one aspect of one mechanism of repression that I've highlighted in my research with Psy. And there's much more we could talk about here, but I'm going to try to focus on lawfare. How I would define lawfare is the use of law and policy, usually in selective and politically motivated ways, to repress dissent or shape ideas and what ideas and speech are permissible. When it comes to higher education, I would divide lawfare into two kind of broad categories, which is lawfare by the state, and then a lawfare enacted by the university. So in terms of the state, in recent years, Scholars at Risk has found that state authorities and lawmakers have used the powers of their respective offices in ways that systematically undermine academic freedom, the right to education, institutional autonomy on virtually all corners of the globe. Just to highlight a couple of examples, in the United States, governments including in states like Florida, Texas, Ohio, and Tennessee have passed legislation related to banning courses and also offices that focus on issues related to critical race theory, issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender studies, and other, quote, divisive topics. And these laws are often framed as preserving free speech. And again, this is the language thing, but actually do the opposite, damaging academic freedom. A few more examples. In Pakistan, a bill passed in 2023 giving the Higher Education Commission increased powers over provincial higher education institutions, and the Prime Minister the power to dismiss the HEC chairperson. And the government framed this bill as a way to empower the HEC, but experts have argued that the move actually reduces the role of provincial governments and provincial higher education departments in regulating research according to regional needs. And then in Nicaragua, the government has justified the takeover of numerous educational institutions, claiming that the schools have failed to meet administrative reporting requirements. To move on to lawfare enacted by the university, I think this is most obvious where in kind of classically authoritarian places where university autonomy is the weakest. So in Zimbabwe, where the chancellor of the state university system is the president, there's a long history of surveillance and academic pressure on student dissenters. However, lawfare also occurs more broadly than that. I have a quote, which unfortunately is, I think, cut off of the screen. That's from my research with Psy. And in that research, the students that we interviewed qualitatively overwhelmingly pointed to kind of policy and norms and rules by the university as the factor that most inhibited their activism. So this is a quote from a student from Central America who described, if university authorities know someone is organizing, what they do is erase their academic record, delay their diploma, or simply make their academic life more difficult. They push them till they leave or till they go somewhere else. And I think Chancel's experience is a perfect illustration of that, unfortunately. So such lawfare can take place on an individual basis, but it can also be facilitated through the establishment of new policies. So just yesterday, I researched a case in the United States where American University in DC has instituted a new policy and without consulting faculty that bans protests from all indoor spaces on campus and also threatens to withdraw the registration of any student group that is not welcoming to others. And it's a pretty extensive ban on protest activity on campus. All universities regulate protest activity, but this goes the furthest of anything that I've seen to really ban it. And then, one of the things that we've seen at SAR in recent years is an escalation in the in faculty members losing their positions. So loss of position is one of the things that we track for the Academic Freedom Monitoring Project. And the proportion of cases that we saw this past year has increased over previous years. And that's really been driven by the United States, where professors have lost their positions for teaching disfavored topics. Russia, where professors have been fired for public dissent or labeled as foreign agents or anti-war activists intent on discrediting the Russian government. And then also Iran, where there's a kind of decade-long history, or more than decade-long history, of university faculty members their contracts being terminated. But that has really escalated in recent years. And usually the reason given is that they've failed to meet some kind of requirement, or, it's couched in kind of legitimate terms. We'll just take a couple minutes to conclude with one of the projects that Scholars at Risk is working on to try to promote academic freedom and push back against these challenges that we're seeing. And so we believe at Scholars at Risk that one of the main obstacles in addressing the decline in academic freedom is that the world has not yet recognized that academic freedom is as important to a free society as an independent judiciary, a strong civil society, and a free press. So to that end, we have convened a working group of international experts to assess current protections and move beyond recognition and awareness into the actual realization of a right to academic freedom. And what came out of this is the draft principles for implementing the right of academic freedom that we released last March. The draft identifies 9 essential aspects of academic freedom, which includes the right to engage with a diversity of knowledge and ideas, the autonomy of academic institutions, the right to engage in expression and discourse, and the right to access, develop, interpret, and share this information. And these principles are well grounded in existing human rights principles, and if fully implemented, would substantially guarantee the protection, promotion, and employment of a right of academic freedom. That we currently have them available in draft form, but we're currently finalizing them, and the final version of the principles should be out within the next few months. I'll conclude there. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to hearing to the discussion and comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. And to all of you, I wanted to have a better sense of what is happening, and I feel now very overwhelmed by all of your inputs from different perspectives and highlighting also different things. Before we move to the questions from the audience, some questions already have been sent in, and audience, please keep on sending them in. I wanted to use the privilege of being the moderator to ask the first questions, where I have 2. So as all of you mentioned, there are kind of more fundamental things that are being attacked by the illiberal forces. Jens, you mentioned that the fundamental values of European education traditions are being attempted to be changed. But we also have seen through more specific examples how certain issues or studies are being under attack, like gender, minority rights, immigration, also human rights. So my question would be, why do we see specific issues and these specific issues being addressed? What is the mobilizing aspect behind that? And also, what will come next? Because it has been evolving. So where do you see this going or expanding? And I wanted to start, this question is to all of you, but I wanted to start with you, Andrea, because you have also written that gender is a symbolic glue of illiberal states. So if you could expand on that and kind of we can maybe discuss that into wider issues of.
Thank you, Elena. So that's I mean, let me go back to the talk when I was saying the first step is to recognize what is happening, right? Because there is this famous saying that if you want to get out from the hole, you should stop digging first, right? So that's a very good approach to stop digging and get out from that hole. And for example, the first step could be that, the solution for all the problems is not to hope that others would not think what they are thinking at the moment, and to shame them why they are thinking what they think they are thinking. To stop saying that they are deplorables, to use Hillary Clinton's famous adjective, but think about what is happening now. And what is happening now is that that there is an illiberal alternative to the liberal democracies, to the neoliberal democracies, and this illiberal offer is getting more and more support. It is getting more and more electoral support, and the liberals recognize that the higher education, knowledge production, academic authorization, education are strategic fields. This is a tragedy that in the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, in the European and in the global context, this has been forgotten. And if you look at the numbers, you see that there is this major trend of privatization of higher education and setting up a model of fee-paying students running the higher educational institution. The students are becoming consumers and they demand service. And the students are actually consumers and they are not partners in thinking. So this kind of transformation of the higher education in the past 20, 30 years actually very much undermines the concept of backsliding, because there is nowhere to backslide, because from bad to worse, it's really difficult to slide back. So my argument here is that first, we need to recognize what are the major problems of the present higher educational system, and try to understand what is that, because this polypore actually develops in the cracks of the system. Where are the cracks? And these cracks are the results of the neoliberalized managerial knowledge production, and then the students are expected to that they should learn and believe and be on the labor market, and that's it. So this kind of disenchantment of higher education, that the university students are subjects who need to be taught and in vast numbers, and then they are gone, that is actually opened up the space for this illiberal offer. So what is the illiberal offer? The illiberal offer is appropriating the previous structures. They are using universities, they are using the vocabulary of this, and I don't know if you have seen the different alternative institutions which are set up in Krakow, in Warsaw, interestingly in the eastern part of Europe, the so-called New Europe. There the language is Latin, and they are they are training students in the social work, in human rights, in international law. So in that part of the science, which is which is close to people. So this is a response to the populist attack on an elitist activity, which is higher education, that they are changing the constituency, saying that we are opening this up for a wider audience. And this kind of higher education is having small groups of students, face-to-face consultation. So it is really going back to the origins and the, like in the Middle Ages or in the antiquities, when this was a small group of people who were working on this. And the reason is because they are preparing for a new world order. And this is a part of this Gramscian socializational fight, and they are offering an alternative. So that's why in my talk I was arguing that there are some elements of the neoliberalized higher educational system which probably doesn't worth saving from the illiberal attacks, but rather use these illiberal attacks to rethink what is worth teaching, what is the role of intellectual work, and what kind of mission intellectuals have, if they have at all, nowadays in this particular context. So you mentioned gender as a symbolic glue, because I mean all these attacks on gender and gender studies, and at the beginning, the colleagues and the academics were saying, "Oh, they are homophobes and they don't like gays." But no, it is something totally different. And this is I'm sorry to inform the colleagues, this is not about homophobia, and this is not about gays and lesbians, but this is about gender used as a proxy for something totally different. And that's why I'm again stressing this point, that you have to understand what is the problem, what is the fight now, in order to really fight it. Because most of the colleagues were looking at this as a kind of homophobic movement, and it was much more than that. And this kind of gender as a glue, it glues together the different political actors through hate and exclusion, creating a cohesion in the political realm, attacking others. And in that sense, those who were saying this is a homophobic movement and we have to, in that sense, they are right, but they are one step back or behind what is happening really, because this kind of attacks on gender is not about gender. This is about, there is this big picture behind it, namely to create an alternative, what is good, what is acceptable, and what kind of values are ruling our world in the future. And these values are based on exclusion and hate. So in that sense, they are right. But there is a bigger picture. And if we are only focusing on this tiny element, then we are basically losing the big picture, that this is really the question of life and death. So in a sense, Jens was very right pointing out that this Cold War, what we are living in, is actually waged in the field of knowledge production, in the field of the academic freedom, and in the field of protecting certain disciplines as gender studies, critical race theory, and environmental studies from those who have got very different value system. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Would anybody like to add on that?
Maybe just very briefly, I think, because you started off with this question also, why are these value conflicts now so salient in a way? And I think the interesting part of these value conflicts, if I put on like the political scientist head, is that they often are dichotomized. So if you think about redistributive issues, you can say like, okay, I'm in favor of 10% higher tax rate, you're in favor of no higher tax rate, we can somewhere meet in the middle. But if you start discussing these value question, there's often very little middle ground. It's like, it's often an either or question that then actually then leads to more polarization, and that also makes these questions actually a very suitable kind of vehicle to build up what Andrea actually said, to position oneself. Because if you want to kind of create a niche for oneself in a political context, and you start taking up positions that are not taken at the moment, you become very visible, and you become like, you clearly position yourself and demarcate yourself towards others. So, and then these issues have the advantage that they are black and white, or plus and minus, or whatever, 1 or 0. And at the same time, often their implementation doesn't cost money. That's also very handy if one is a government and wants to follow up on these positions, that outlawing or certain study programs, or legislating into educational content doesn't cost you any tax money. So it's actually also easy to fulfill election promises, so to speak.
Yeah, so we're also seeing this, going back to the issue of resources that several of you mentioned, that it's both relating to these retributive issues, but also how the resources are being taken away and given to other alternative options. Before I give you the questions from the audience, moving to maybe looking forward. Andrea, you also mentioned these failures, betrayals, and what we can learn from the things that have already been happening. And Amy, you gave us also this very nice overview of, you know, how people also, and scholars in different parts of the world are also been dealing with this, and maybe what we can see that this pushing people out and pushing away has been very kind of a active strategy, both for people leaving, it's a way how to deal with it, but it's also a strategy used by pushing scholars and institutions and students out from certain spaces. So, but what if we think about the possible responses and forms of resistance by academia, also knowing what we know today, looking at the experiences we have, success stories, if we have any. And yeah, so how do we go further from here? Amy, would you like to
I will
start?
just say one thing. So one of the things that is really coming out in the research on with student activists, as we're looking at the data that we've collected, is the role of community. So this is like a very not kind of non-specific response, but one of the things, so something that comes out is how much. So one is, and I think this builds off of what, sorry, I'm thinking through my answer as I'm talking, but I think this builds off of what Andrea was talking about, that that a lot of the illiberal attack on society, not just higher education, is built on hate and division and divisiveness. And one of the things that comes through in talking to student activists is how much kind of individual commitment and commitment it takes to maintain their position as a student activist, to continue the work that they're doing, and how the main thing that they talk about as supporting that work is ties with others, ties with other student activists, ties with their community, ties with their family. And so I think one of the things that pushes back against the hate and ultimately the illiberalism is bolstering those ties, because I think that that really this is about, the attack is about tearing apart ties, building hate, building division between people. I do think that higher education institutions are a good place for doing that in theory. I don't know that they have they aren't always that in practice. In fact, they are often very much the opposite in practice. But in theory, you have a space where that is supposed to be a community. And I think that the forces of kind of marketization and capitalism are part of what tears apart that community, which is why I think Andrea is so right to point to neoliberalism as really tied up with and a foundation of illiberalism. So that's a very non-specific response, but a start to a response.
Thank you, Amy. Jens?
Yeah, to build on this, I would also, and I'm an optimist in general, and I also think it's like one good sign is also that like people talk about the issue. We're talking about the academic freedom. There is something like the Academic Freedom Index now being delivered. A year ago, Andrea and I talked about academic freedom here in Oslo. So I think there's more space for these activities, more visibility for it. Also politically, both the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, the European Higher Education Area, all of these kind of forums for European higher education policy are talking about academic freedom and how to make sense of it. One can be more or less disillusionized about where this will lead, but at least there's a discursive space where this is brought up, where experts are invited, where data is collected, data is discussed, and the attempt is there to kind of understand what has been taken for granted so far and what shouldn't be taken for granted anymore, and what needs to be done to safeguard certain foundations. And I think it's really good to see this. And I think partly that we can also see this in increased academic focus on it when it comes to research being done of it. And the book that Andrea shared in the comments is also one example of this. So I think there maybe is also a reason for optimism, is like, yeah, you know, we've taken this for granted too long, but now we're actually getting at it. And yes, I mean, Scholars Like Risk has been there for a long time, and they've been looking at this for a long time. But I think especially us in Western Europe, we didn't take it as a local problem, but a foreign problem. And we're increasingly realizing it's also a local problem, and that's a good thing.
It's always good to have a positive note in the discussions. Andrea?
Yes, thank you, Jens, for this positivity, and I would like to support that, and especially because if you look at the waves when universities were founded, you see that the last wave was in the 1989, 1991, including my university, the CEU, and also in the national context, in the post-communist, in the new Europe. And after that, there is this no-show. And now we see an alternative institutionalization, which are the illiberals institutionalizing their knowledge production and their academic authorization. So I really support what Jens was saying, that the European context, I mean, we will see what kind of European Parliament we will have in June, but let's hope that there in the European context, there should be a response to this kind of no-show of new universities on the progressive side, because the number of challenges increased. And if you look at the history of Europe or the different countries, you see that when there is a challenge, when there are the polycrisis, there is a new context. The first is that you create a space where people can actually discuss this. And at the moment, the world is very much ripe for this kind of new institutions because of the climate change, because of the wars, because of the artificial. There are so many challenges which require a new institutionalization, not only this small ivory towers and departments run by knights and barons and counts, but something which is in a different framework. So I would say that following Jens' positive approach, that true, and these institutions which were institutionalized, they were not coming from nowhere. They came from these discussions. what we are doing here and what we have done with Jens in Oslo a year ago. And hopefully in the different kitchen tables and around certain alcoholic drinks in the pubs. So this might happen at a certain point. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Chantal.
I also wanna like continue with Andrea's point, especially with like discussions that is rising from like our kitchens, pubs. Like in Turkey, we like drink a lot with our professors tea, coffee, and many other beverages to talk about like what other forms of resistance can exist. And I can also talk about a bit of like the responses, reactions, and forms of resistance within the like different communities in Turkey and the intricate dynamic structures of it. The historical example at this point is like Occupy Gezi still remains a potent like symbol of resistance in Turkey, showing that there is a space for resistance. And even though we can talk about is it a failure, is it not very achieved what it wants to achieve, but still it was a resistance in Turkey's complex socio-political like landscape with like especially predominant existence of universities and the establishment of organizations like Bir Derneği by expelled academicians in Turkey and formation of ADA, which is like a gender equality solidarity network by participations of academics working in the field of like gender solidarity, academics formed by like dismissed from public service during the state of emergency in Turkey, and whether abroad or within Turkey, these diverse forms of response and resistance within civil society exist and continue to exist. And in the face of negative public opinions and state oppression, still like pockets of process emerge, like exemplified by the like Uniqueer itself. It's like the Uniqueer stemmed from these challenges, including the arrest of students and academicians in 2019 and during like 2-year-long legal processes and charges leading the organization's establishments and advocating for like students' freedom within the students, within the university organizations to like achieve more academic freedom and inclusive universities. And these like recent instances, even though they are pushing back the prides in universities, we are having more pride marches, we're making more academic picnics, vegan picnics, so that we come together, we talk, and maybe continue this fire that's like initial fire inside of us. Yeah.
Thank you, Chantal. Very important to look and be aware of spaces where the resistance is being forged. So, questions from audience. I was thinking about putting them together a bit so that they are kind of grouped thematically. So the first question about specific sciences, maybe, or studies. First question is about STEM. I'm surprised to see that STEM was mentioned as a focal point here. I was always under the impression that the right is mostly immune against science and facts, and rather create their own alternate reality. So that is one, and there's also another one, and I think these both were kind of to Jens and Andrea more. We often see restrictions on social sciences under far-right governments and altering the academia to prevent social sciences. Often we see climate change denial alongside their other rhetoric, for example, Bolsonaro in Brazil. How does this affect teaching of environmental sciences in universities? And environmental sciences were also mentioned already. So, Andrea, Jens, who would like to go first? Andrea, Jens?
Okay, I can maybe quickly on the STEM point, because like reaching out to, there's a more general literature also on this in political science, partly economics, that kind of ask this question about how do autocracies handle the challenge between opening up, but at the same time that they don't want to do too much because it's a threat to the regime. But on the other hand, you want to be, you want to have a successful national economy. And successful national economies nowadays demand high-skilled workers. And so in this literature, there's exactly this discussion about a focus on STEM as a way to educate your people with practical skills without making them too critical towards the regime, versus a focus on social science, which kind of breeds your own opposition in a way. So there are some arguments in that literature that the focus on STEM comes partly from this idea of you have a need for higher education nowadays. You can't just say like we're going to abolish all universities. And that's also what Andrea pointed to, is people creating their own institution and not saying, oh, we're just going to shut down universities. But then the question is, how do you get the reward that you want, people who have a high level of specific skills, without getting the problem as autocratic country or a country that is moving towards more autocratic structures, that you educate people towards opposition to what you're planning to do. Because there are also studies that clearly show that there is a link between the existence of higher education institutions and more likelihood for civil unrest and protests. So universities are in general a dangerous institution for autocratic environments. And so focusing on STEM vis-a-vis social science can be one of the coping mechanisms there.
Thanks, Jens. Andrea?
Thank you. I think this is really important because it shows the center of illiberal thinking. And one is what Jens was mentioning, namely that these governments want to make money and they are interested in somehow keeping a certain presence in the world arena. But there comes a moment when this is no longer possible or desirable. And then they are using the existing educational system or grant-giving system to channel money to those who are totally inappropriate and half illiterates, and they are not really producing anything reasonable. So the good example is that a Hungarian member of the parliament who's received a huge research grant to do research from the Hungarian National Research Fund, I think. And that is actually a good illustration that the money which is coming from the higher education is used to build up the clientele and not for producing knowledge. So again, please think about this metaphor of the polypore, which is misusing the different structures. And also, the STEM is considered to be kind of a value-free objective science, unlike humanities and social sciences. And of course, we all know that this is not the case, but and it's the world and the future is very much decided by how and in what sense this kind of future vision of this STEM not controlled by citizens and not controlled by public interest will look like. And the STEM research is, of course, creating an imaginary for the future. And therefore, it's important for the liberals to control it. And it's also important to make sure that this is not successful. And it has another dimension. I don't want to be more specific, but a certain very high level Hungarian politician is a lobbyist for a German car production company. It means that this person managed to get certain state public money to the institutions to check and to work on the self-driving cars. And this research was directly channeled back to this German car industry. So it also shows that the public money is also channeled to private stakeholders in a different country. So the different inequalities, which are very much present in the European and in the global knowledge production sphere, is also playing a role. And let me repeat that the illiberals are using the cracks. They don't have any original ideas. They are just using the cracks which are there. And these inequalities are used, misused, instrumentalized by the different illiberal forces to increase inequalities, also in knowledge production. Thank you.
Very important points about inequalities. Group is always happy to also diverge or show the attention to the inequality issues, which we also see are so much intertwined with illiberalism and rise of illiberalism. The final question, because I think we don't have much more time, it always runs out so fast, is about red flags. So, question goes as follows. Amy showed a graph illustrating some countries' more gradual decline, transition towards illiberalism, USA, compared to more obvious shifts towards it, Afghanistan. While it is clear to see there are societal changes, especially in American system as an example, are there more specific triggers or red flags we need to be looking out for as we move forward? It feels like gradual change are exactly that, gradual. It sometimes feels quite challenging to see these changes as they maybe become more normalized, perhaps, and when they happen much slower than others. So what are the red flags we need to watch out for?
I mean, there is one very clear red flag. When gender studies is attacked, the rest will follow. Or if critical race studies is attacked, the rest will follow. If somebody comes up with certain ideas about the climate change denial, the rest will follow. And when you have got these public intellectuals who are first formulating this kind of claims, they are just testing what is the reaction, and then comes the next wave, who are the paid intellectuals, and then taking over the different institutions and also then the legislation. So I would say this is coming in waves. So that's why the red flag is a very good point to discuss. Thanks.
So we have seen this pattern elsewhere. So follow the examples that have been. Amy?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we need to be looking for the small things that people are doing that seem like relatively harmless. So some of the examples that stand out to me on campuses are rules on where you can hang posters on campus, or I had another one in my head that has now gone out of my head as an example, but kind of the small things like that, limiting I had like cancellation of events being canceled. Those are some of the things that I think are like where you see it where you see the kind of illiberal practices slipping into the mainstream practices. And those seem so kind of particularly things like hanging posters, they seem so relatively inconsequential, and yet it's just such a slippery slope.
Thank you. Jan Chansal, anything else to add before we close down? So from small things we need to pay attention to, we have covered both how we need to pay attention to events cancelled, to more fundamental changes within our societies and educational institutions. So I think we have covered quite a lot of topics throughout our talk. So unfortunately, our time is out. I'm happy that we had over 40 participants, guests, following our discussions. It shows that there are concerns out there and that people are very much interested in the topic, and how timely, or even maybe in some cases too late, we are having these discussions. But on behalf of the group, I would just like to thank you all for the insightful discussions. Special thanks to our distinguished panelists, Amy, Andrena, Jens, and Chantal. It was a true pleasure to hear your input on and reflections on illiberalism as such and the dynamics between illiberalism and academia, a field which unfortunately we all must be aware of to an increasing degree and also be ready to tackle and support our colleagues dealing with illiberal policies in various contexts around the globe. So I hope we can continue, and we definitely should continue conversations on these topics, as just paying attention and raising awareness about these issues is also one way of dealing with them. But I hope we can continue discussions both on and off the screen and contribute to raising awareness about these issues and readiness and fight against the rise of illiberalism. So thank you so much, all of you, and have a lovely day, and we'll keep in touch.